Lesson 53, the perfect infinitive, review of the infinitive, the perfect and supine systems, Caesar Book 1, Chapter 3 concluded. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. I'm William E. Lenny, author of the book Getting Started with Latin. I hope you're enjoying this recorded lecture series. Today we are on page 157 in Lesson 53, and today we're going to talk more about infinitives. Now, I've been telling you over the past few lessons about the way tenses work in indirect speech. Remember that whenever you have indirect speech, you need a subject accusative, and then you need an infinitive to be the verb of the indirect statement. And then the tense of the action happening in the indirect statement is relative to the tense of the verb in the main clause, the main verb. So far, we've only been working with present tense infinitives in the indirect statements that we've seen. But in Latin, there are more kinds of infinitives than just present tense infinitives. If you have an indirect statement and the infinitive verb within that indirect statement is in the present tense, it goes in the same tense as the tense of the main verb. If the tense of the infinitive verb in the indirect statement is a past tense infinitive, the action will be portrayed as before the timing of the main verb. And if it's a future tense infinitive, that action will be after the time of the main verb. So the timing of the action in the indirect statement is not absolute. It's not just depending on the tense of the infinitive. Instead, it is keyed to the main verb. It is relative to the main verb. Again, so far we have only seen present tense infinitives in the indirect discourse that we've seen. But that's all going to change now, because in this lesson we're learning about the perfect tense infinitive. So once we know this infinitive, it's a past tense infinitive. It's an infinitive that is talking about past action. What that will allow us to do is have indirect statements in which action is described as happening before the time of the main verb. So that's the new thing, is we're learning the perfect infinitive. And so after this, we'll know the present infinitive and the perfect infinitive. And so then we'll be able to have indirect discourse with more sophistication as far as verb tenses. We'll be able to have action happening at the same time as the main verb and before the main verb. So that's where we're headed with all this. But in order to get there, we have to study how to form the perfect infinitive. And so that's what we're doing here in the first section of this lesson. That's section 419. Let's read it together. It says, the perfect infinitive. The perfect active infinitive is formed by adding ISSE to the perfect stem. So that's how you make the perfect active infinitive. For example, if you have laudo, the first conjugation verb that we always use for an example, you'll have laudo, laudare, laudavi. That's the perfect tense, first person singular. Take away the letter I, and you have the perfect stem, L-A-U-D-A-V, laudaw. So L-A-U-D-A-V, and then we add I-S-S-E to that. So that would give us laudawisse, and the meaning of laudawisse just on its own would be to have praised. It's an infinitive that means to praise, but in the past. So it's like to have praised. It's an infinitive, but a past tense infinitive. So that is the active one. Let's continue reading in section 419. It says, the perfect passive by combining esse with the perfect participle. So again, if you have laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum from the first conjugation, you could take the perfect passive participle, laudatus, and then add esse to it, and have laudatus esse Laudata esse, laudatum esse. And that would mean to have been praised. It's an infinitive, it's in the past tense, but it's also passive. So we have a perfect active and a perfect passive infinitive. Again, for laudo, that would be laudavisse, to have praised, and then laudatus esse, to have been praised. Let's turn the page to page 158, and we'll see some examples here, including the one I just gave you about laudavisse and laudatus esse. The perfect infinitive really isn't difficult. Again, you're just taking the perfect stem, and you add isse, that's isse. So for moneo, monere, monui would be the perfect tense first person singular. Remove the letter I, and that gives you monu. That's the perfect stem, and then you add isse, so monuisse. For the verb rego from the third conjugation, you'd have rego, regere, rexi. Remove the I, and you get rex. That's the perfect stem. Add isse, and you get rexisse, to have ruled. For capio, the third conjugation io example verb, you would have capio, capere capi. Remove the I, and you get cep, and that's the perfect stem. Add isse, and you get capisse, to have taken. Again, these are active infinitives. For audio, from the fourth conjugation, audio, audire, audivi. Take away the I, and you get audiv. That's the perfect stem. Add isse, and you get audivisse. Okay, so these verbs here mean to have praised, to have warned, or to have advised, for monuisse. Rexisse, to have ruled. Capisse, to have taken. Audivisse, to have heard. So it's an infinitive, but it's talking about past action. So it means to have done something in the past. And then the passive forms are even easier. The perfect passive infinitive, all you do is take the perfect passive participle and add esse to it. That's it. Laudatus esse, monatus esse, rectus esse, captus esse, auditus esse. Remember that these are gendered verbs, so if it's a person that's being talked about, the gender of the participle will have to match the gender of the person being discussed. In indirect speech, you'll have to put the participle into the accusative case because in indirect speech, the subject is a subject accusative. So that subject goes in the accusative case. So when you formulate the infinitive with a participle, that participle has to be accusative to match the subject. It has to agree with the subject in case, number, and gender. So that's an added thing you have to deal with when you are working with these passive verbs in indirect speech. So they have to agree with the subject accusative in gender, in case, in number, blah, blah, blah. And that's because participles are verbal adjectives. They act as adjectives, and adjectives have to agree with things. So that's how that works. And a quick note here under the examples in section 419, the term for what they're talking about here is syncopation. That's the linguistic term for it. You can chop out the letter V as they show you here, laudace. That's really laudavisse. And the way they're describing it is that the V goes away, and then that leaves an A and an I next to each other. And then the A and the I contract. They just squish together into one vowel. And so, laudace. It looks like the V and the I are just dropping out. But the way they're describing it is just the V drops out, and then the I basically gets absorbed into the A. That's called vowel contraction. For those of you who have studied ancient Greek, you're probably used to that because it happens all the time in Greek. That's really one of the main tasks you do when you're a first-year Greek student, is to memorize all the vowel contractions that can happen in Greek because they're just so ubiquitous. You have to deal with them almost constantly. Not so much in Latin, though. So when we do see it in Latin, it's kind of a special thing, I think. Also, it's not talked about in Latin books nearly as much as it's talked about in Greek textbooks. Moving along to section 420, we have a review of all the different kinds of infinitives. This is lesson 53 of the lecture series, so we may have learned the future infinitive at some point in the past, and I forgot about it. So that's here on the chart too. So for active infinitives, we have just re as the ending, like laudare. That's the present active infinitive. For the perfect tense, active infinitive, laudavisse. We just covered that. For a future tense, active infinitive, we have a future active participle, which would be laudaturus, and then esse along with that. And they're pointing us back to section 348 there, if you want to go back and review that. So laudaturus on its own would mean about to praise. And then along with esse, it would be to be about to praise. So it's kind of a makeshift infinitive comprised of two words. For passive infinitives, moving to the right column, we have R and then a long I for the present tense passive infinitive. For laudo, that would be laudari with a long I. In parentheses, they have the letter I there with a macron. That's referring to third conjugation verbs. That's how they get their passive infinitive. Instead of ri, it's just I. For example, rego regere, from the third conjugation, the present tense passive infinitive would be regi. Instead of regeri, it's just regi. You don't have the R there. For the perfect passive infinitive, as I just covered a few minutes ago, we take the perfect passive participle and attach esse to it. Very similar to the future active infinitive, it's just a participle plus esse, sort of a Frankenstein verb form or a makeshift verb form that includes a participle plus a verb of being. Grammarians call that kind of thing a periphrastic tense. The word periphrastic comes from Greek roots. Peri means around, and then the phrastic, P-H-R-A-S, that part of the word means to speak. So literally it's to speak around something or to talk about something in a roundabout kind of way. And so when you put a participle and a verb of being together, it's seen as kind of something of a roundabout way to make a verb form. And so that's why they're called periphrastic verb forms or periphrastic tenses. The future passive infinitive is a rare thing. We just recently covered it. It's got this passive present tense infinitive of eo, which means to go. You can think of it as being impersonal, like there is a going occurring. The activity of going is occurring. And then combine that with an accusative supine, and you have this sort of idiomatic way to say that there is a going occurring for the purpose of such and such. And then when you add all that up, it ends up serving the purpose of a future passive infinitive. It's not very common. I think I read somewhere the other day that in all of Caesar's Gallic Wars, all 8 books of it, you only see it 4 times. So, not a very common thing. Nevertheless, it's probably good to be aware of since you are moving forward and becoming more advanced in your knowledge of Latin grammar. As far as practicing all these forms, I will leave that up to you. You are at the point now that you know enough about verbs to be able to look at paradigms on your own. You can speak them, write them out, whatever you need to do to memorize them. Remember, learning Latin takes practice. You have to practice the verb forms. Memorization is good. Again, as I always recommend, speaking the language is a great way to get accustomed to morphology. Just saying the forms over and over in context, in sentences, in conversations, hearing other people say the forms in conversations, listening to recordings of people saying them, all that listening and speaking, it's a great way to master or at least get familiar with all these different verb forms. Because if you get to the point where you can actually express yourself with these things and you are familiar with them enough to be able to make up a sentence correctly with them, well, that's really saying something. And certainly, if you were to see it in a text, it'll be much easier to recognize once you've reached that level of familiarity with it. So again, as I always say, speaking Latin, treating it as an actual language that's not just written, but also spoken, heard, written, read. There are 4 ways to experience language, and I've actually read this from other people too, so it's not just me saying this. Reading it, writing it, speaking it, and hearing it. So if you only read Latin, you're just getting 1 out of those 4 ways. But if you have conversations in Latin, if you view it as a spoken language, then you get reading plus speaking plus listening. So if you do that, you're getting 3 out of the 4 ways instead of just 1 of the 4 ways. So that really kind of supercharges your studies of the language. Finally, you can add to that doing some written Latin composition, typing emails to your friends, writing out sentences. That's a great way to get some practice as well. And then if you do that, you're experiencing the language in all 4 ways: reading, writing, speaking, listening. So try to approach the language that way, and you're going to get a much more complete and full language experience than if you only read Latin texts. And it will thoroughly enrich not only your learning of the Latin language, but your appreciation of it too, because you'll be experiencing it in so many different ways. And plus, it's just a lot of fun to do. Okay, enough of that. Moving on now to section 421. I've been telling you this for quite some time, but now they're officially presenting it here in the book. That is the tenses of how the infinitive works in indirect speech. 421 is where we are. Tenses of the infinitive. Section 1 here, it says, the present infinitive denotes the same time as the principal verb. And of course, what they're referring to here is indirect speech. So they have an example sentence here. Dicit se laudare. Dicit is a form of the verb dico, which means to say. Dicit is present tense. And number 2, it's dixit, which is perfect tense. So that's the big difference between 1 and 2. Number 1 is dicit se laudare. He says that he is praising, or he says that he praises. The only difference with number 2 is it's dixit, perfect tense. So that one says he said that he was praising. In both sentences, the verb in the indirect statement is a present tense infinitive. So for both of those, we put the infinitive laudare into the same tense as the main verb. So in number 1, se laudare gets translated as that he is praising because the main verb is present. So we stay in the present. But in number 2, the main verb is in the perfect tense. So when we translate laudare in that one, we need to put that into the perfect tense as well. So it's in the same tense as the main verb. So we use the word was, and we say, he said that he was praising. Or you could say, as they have here, you could say, he said that he praised. Either way, the idea is that you render it into English in such a way where the action is happening in the past along with the timing of the main verb. Moving on to part 2, here in section 421, now we're going to talk about how to have the infinitive in indirect discourse describing action that took place before that of the main verb. So let's read what it says. The perfect infinitive denotes time before that of the principal verb, or what I call the main verb. So look closely here at the top of page 159. Dicit se laudavisse. Dicit is present tense, so that's he says, and then we have se as our subject accusative. So he says that he, and now we have laudavisse, that's a perfect tense infinitive. The main verb is in the present tense, so we have to put the perfect infinitive, laudavisse, we have to render that into English in such a way where it's happening before the time of the main verb. So the idea is he says, now in the present tense, he says that he in the past praised. Okay, so he says that he praised. But what about number 2? What if the main verb is in the perfect tense and the infinitive verb of the indirect statement is also in the perfect tense? Then what do? Well, the way to make something sound like it happened before the perfect tense is to move it one notch further into the past. And how can we do that? With the pluperfect tense. The pluperfect tense is a tense that describes action that happened not just in the past, but you're saying that at some past time, at some time in the past, there had already been some action that already was completed at that past time. So sometimes I say it's the past of the past. So if you rent a car on Monday and then you drive over to visit your friend on Wednesday, and then Friday comes along and you're talking and your friend says, "Hey, did you rent your car on Wednesday?" You could say, "No, on Wednesday I had already rented it." The action of the renting occurred on Monday. So by the time Wednesday rolled around, you had already completed the action of renting the car. So on Friday, if you're talking about Wednesday, you're saying that on Wednesday, the activity of renting already had been completed. So in that sense, you're not just one notch into the past by using the perfect tense. It's like you're 2 levels into the past. It's the past of the past, because you're saying that at a time in the past, in this case Wednesday, some action already had been completed by that time. Again, in English, we use the word had for that. So number 2 here says, he said, that's perfect tense, dixit, he said that he, at a time before that, praised. And so the way we're going to express that in English is with the word had, and that makes it pluperfect in English. So for number 2, what that gives us is the main verb is in the perfect tense, and then we translate that perfect tense infinitive into English as the pluperfect. So he said that he had praised. That way, in English, we can represent it as having happened before the main verb. So if the main verb is present, and then the infinitive in the indirect statement is perfect, we can just use a simple perfect to translate it, as in number 1. But if the main verb is perfect, and then the action in the indirect discourse happened even before that, then we have to use the English pluperfect to render that into English. So that's how that works. Moving on to number 3, we're going to talk about future infinitives and how they work in indirect speech. 2 examples yet again. Dicit is present tense. That means he says, or he is saying. And then se is the subject accusative. So he says that he, and then laudaturem esse is a future tense infinitive. Notice that laudaturem is accusative because it has to agree with the subject accusative, se. So it's not dicit se laudaturus esse, that wouldn't make any sense. Se is accusative, so laudaturum, as a participle, has to agree with it. So laudaturum esse, together, says to be about to praise. It's the idea of to praise, but with a feeling of futureness to it. To be going to praise, or to be about to praise. You have to figure out some way in English to express the futurity of it. So in the context of indirect discourse, it says something like, he says that he will praise. And so by saying he will praise, that puts the action of the future infinitive after the time of the main verb. Now it's a little bit weird with example 2 because Dixit is perfect tense. So he said that he, and now we have a future infinitive. So he said in the past that he in the future after that would praise. I suppose we could translate it as he said that he will praise. But, when we translate that and we have someone saying that he will praise, but he said it in the past, we don't really know when that will be. There's a feeling of uncertainty about exactly when that's happening. So in English, translators oftentimes, as you see here, they use the word would, W-O-U-L-D, to give it a sense of, openness or not trying to nail down exactly when it is. So instead of saying, he said that he will praise, it's just, he said that he would praise. Remember that with the future tense, there is always a feeling of uncertainty that surrounds it. If you say you're doing something right now and you're actually doing it, that's kind of a certain thing because your actions are showing that your words are meaningful, that they're talking about real action. If you did something yesterday and then you tell someone that you did it, you're talking about real action. But when you talk about the future, there really is no guarantee that that activity or that action will ever actually take place. At best, we can think of the future tense as a prediction or a desire or an intention, perhaps, intended action. But when you really think about it, the future tense is not real action. It's action that's intended, hoped for, wished for. And so, in that sense, it's unreal action. And I think that's part of the reason why, for this second example, Dixit se laudaturum esse, I think that's part of the reason why English translators use the word would to help express that that future action is not really a dependable, solid thing. It's just action that's being talked about, intended, or wanted. So that's a long-winded way to say that that kind of thing gets translated often with the word would instead of the word will. Let's move on to section 422. That's our vocabulary section for this lesson. We have the verb takeo. That's a verb of the second conjugation, takeo, takere, takoi, taketum, and that means to be silent. In English, we have the word tacit, T-A-C-I-T, which means silent. If you say that someone gave you their tacit approval, it doesn't mean that they said it out loud, that they approve of what you're doing, but that they didn't ever express any disapproval with it. So in a sense, they gave you silent approval or tacit approval. And in fact, tacit really is the third person singular present tense form of takeo. It means he, she, or it is silent. So I think that particular conjugated verb form found its way into English. Also, we have the English word taciturn, which I think means someone who doesn't talk much. It's another related English word. Next, we have concido. I did not know this, but there actually is a third conjugation verb. That's sido, S-I-D-O, which means to sit. So concido, considere. But then it has the third and fourth principal parts that look very much like sedeo from the second conjugation, which also means to sit. In the dictionary, the third principal part for sedo is sidi, S-I-D-I, but here it's sedi, which makes it look like the third and fourth principal parts here are the same as for the second conjugation verb sedeo. So this is kind of a strange verb. Anyway, sedo from the third conjugation and sedeo from the second conjugation, they both mean the same thing, to sit. They're probably etymologically related somehow. We have lots of English words related to this, especially the fourth principal part, sesum. We have English words like session. If you have a recording session, it's a sitting. You're sitting there recording. If you have sediment building up in your pipes, that means that things are sinking down and settling down and accumulating in the sense that they're sitting or settling to the bottom of something. If you're sedentary, that means you sit a lot. So we have tons of English words related to this. Moving on, largior, that's a deponent verb. Largior, largiri, largitus sum, which means to give lavishly or bribe. In English, we have the word largesse, which means generosity. That's the only related English word I can think of. Next, we have reperio, reperire, reperi, repertum, which means to find out or discover. This verb is comprised of two parts, the re part, which means back or again, and then the rest of it is the verb pario, which means to bring forth, like to give birth. It can mean that. So just 4 new words for this time. Time now for our translation exercises here in section 423. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all the exercises. And when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Hopefully by now you've finished your homework. Let's take a look at these exercises together, starting with number 1. Number 1 says, Nuntiamus oppidum esse munitum. Here we have some indirect discourse. Nuntiamus says, we are announcing or we are reporting. And then we have indirect speech. For any indirect speech, you need a subject accusative and then an infinitive. So oppidum is the subject accusative, and then esse is the verb. And munitum is an adjective that here is a predicate accusative. Well, not exactly a predicate accusative. It's a predicate adjective in the accusative. Technically, it would need to be a noun to be a predicate accusative. It's similar to a predicate accusative in the sense that it is accusative, but it's an adjective. So it's technically, I suppose, a predicate adjective in the accusative case, agreeing with oppidum. So oppidum means town. Esse is the verb of being. Munitum means fortified. That's a perfect passive participle of the verb munio, which means to fortify. So we could actually take this 2 ways. We could treat esse and munitum as one unit, as a perfect tense passive infinitive. So we could say this: we are reporting that the town is fortified. Or we could say, we are reporting that the town, munitum esse, was fortified. So we could treat esse and munitum together as a perfect passive infinitive. The main verb here, nuntiamus, is in the present tense. So if we think of esse and munitum together as a perfect passive infinitive, we would simply translate it as being in the past. We could use the perfect tense and say, we are reporting that the town was fortified. Or we could even say, we are reporting that the town has been fortified. That's another way to put it in the past. Or we could take it separately and say, we are reporting that the town is fortified. I think the thing that makes it ambiguous for us as English speakers is the word order. We want that if it's going to be a perfect tense infinitive, we want it to be munitum esse, with munitum coming first, then esse. With oppidum esse munitum, that makes it look to us like something different. And so I think that for an ancient Roman, this really would not be any different than if it were munitum esse. I think for us, looking at it as a second language, that word order difference might trigger some kind of different viewpoint of it for us. But I think that for an ancient Roman, it would not. I think it would have the same feeling either way, whether it was nuntiamus oppidum esse munitum or nuntiamus oppidum munitum esse. Let's treat it as though esse and munitum are forming a perfect passive infinitive. And let's say we are reporting that the town has been fortified, or we are reporting that the town was fortified. Number 2 is next. Responderunt pacem confirmatam esse. Here we have the same word order as before. We have a verb of speaking, responderunt. That means they responded. It's perfect tense. And then we have indirect speech, starting with pacem as the subject accusative. And I'm almost positive that what the authors of the book want here is for us to take confirmatam esse as one unit, as a perfect tense passive infinitive. And I think that's what they wanted us to do in number 1 as well. Whether it's confirmatam esse or esse confirmatam, either way, I would say let's look at it as an infinitive. So what that gives us is they responded, perfect tense, they responded that, and then we have pacem, which means peace, and then with confirmatam esse, that's a perfect tense passive infinitive of the verb confirmo, which means to strengthen or establish. So here it could mean establish. So they responded that peace is established, but with confirmatam esse being a perfect tense infinitive, because it's in the past, we need to translate it as happening before the timing of the main verb. The main verb is perfect tense, so how can we render it into English with the activity of confirmatam esse being portrayed as happening before the activity of responderunt? They responded that peace, and so what we need is the pluperfect tense in English. We need to say, they responded that peace had been established. And by wording it in that way, we have the establishing happening before the responding. Again, the perfect tense infinitive here in the indirect speech, that needs to come before the timing of the main verb. So to do that, we use the word had in English, which basically gives us the pluperfect tense in English. They responded that peace had been established. Number 3 is next. Dixerunt se a patribus didicisse. Same thing all over again, a verb of saying or speaking followed by indirect discourse. So dixerunt is perfect tense. It means they said. It's a form of the verb dico. And then se is the subject accusative of the indirect statement. Didicisse is a perfect active infinitive. Again, when the infinitive is in the perfect tense like that, within indirect discourse, it's going to come before the time of the main verb. What is the timing of the main verb? The main verb is also in the past. They said that they, and so for didicisse, by the way, that's the verb disco, which means to learn. So to position the activity of learning, to position it in time before that of the main verb, we will use the word had. And so we'll say, they said that they had learned. And then a patribus means from fathers. And we'll throw in the word their because it's from their fathers. And so number 3 says, they said that they had learned from their fathers. We could even throw in the word it and say, learned it from their fathers, but we don't really have to do that. Number 4 is next. Divico respondit Helvetios a suis majoribus institutos esse. The word divico here at first glance looks like the dative singular of someone's name, but divico is actually someone's name. That's the nominative form of a person's name. So the person is named divico. It's not divicus, and that's the dative form. It's actually divico is the nominative form. So that's the subject of the sentence. And so divico respondit says something like divico replied or divico responded. Respondit is perfect tense, third person singular. And again, as we've seen in the other exercises, we're going to have some indirect discourse after that. Helvetios is our subject accusative, and then we have institutos esse as a perfect passive infinitive consisting of a participle plus esse. So divico responded that the Helvetii institutos esse. And here the verb instituo means something like instructed or perhaps trained. It doesn't mean established. It means more like trained or instructed. Notice that institutos is accusative plural because it has to agree with Helvetios. It has to agree with the subject accusative. So divico responded that the Helvetii, and since institutos esse is perfect tense, we have to put that before the main verb. So respondit is perfect tense, and then institutos esse is a perfect tense infinitive, perfect tense passive infinitive. So we need to put institutos esse before the main verb. And as we've done before, we'll use the word had to do that, to make it pluperfect. So divico responded that the Helvetii had been trained or had been instructed a suis majoribus, by their own forefathers or by their own ancestors. Number 5 is next. Liscus dicit se ob eam causam tacuisse. Here we have dicit in the present tense. So instead of someone said, it's someone says in the present. And Liscus is the subject. So Liscus says that he, say is the subject accusative of indirect discourse, and tacuisse is the infinitive verb. That's a perfect active infinitive. It means to have been silent. Here in the context of indirect discourse, we can just translate it like this. Liscus says that he was silent. And then ob eam causam means on account of this cause, or perhaps on account of this reason. So number 5, Liscus says that he was silent on account of this reason. Number 6 is next. Dixisti hostes sub monte concedisse. Here we have a second person verb that is launching indirect discourse. So it's as if you're talking to someone. Dixisti is a perfect tense form of dico, which means to say, but it's second person singular. So it says, you said. Dixisti says, you said, and then we have indirect discourse. Hostes is the subject accusative, that's accusative plural, and then concedisse is a perfect tense active infinitive. So literally, concedo means to sit, but it can also mean to settle down, in this case, it means settle down in the sense of to set up your camp. Because when you have an army and they set up a camp somewhere, they're settling down in that spot. So number 6, you said that the enemies concedisse. Concedisse is perfect tense, so we need to put that as before the activity of the main verb. The main verb is perfect tense, so we'll make concedisse pluperfect so that it sounds like it's before the main verb. So you said that the enemies had encamped, and then sub monte means at the foot of the mountain. One of the meanings of sub is at the foot of. You can use it to mean you're at the foot of a wall. Like if you're walking up to the big wall that surrounds a city, you can say that you're sub muro, at the foot of the wall. Here, you can say you're at the foot of a mountain. So number 6, you said that the enemy had encamped at the foot of the mountain. Number 7 is next. Caesar certior factus est, tres partes copiarum, Helvetios id flumen traduxisse. Here again, we're practicing with indirect speech and working with the different tenses in indirect speech. So the sentence starts out with Caesar as the subject, and then we have the passive verb, factus est. Notice that it's masculine because it's talking about Caesar. So Caesar was made, or Caesar became, or Caesar was done. Literally, that's what factus est could say. Here it's being used as part of the idiom of making someone more certain about something. In other words, informing them about something. Certior means more certain. That's a comparative adjective. So literally, Caesar was made more certain. So Caesar was made more certain. And what that means is that Caesar was informed. By now, you know from experience that that kind of statement can begin indirect discourse. And that's what happens here. So we throw in the word that as we go into the indirect statement, and then we need a subject accusative, and then we need an infinitive to be the verb within the indirect discourse. Here, the subject of the indirect statement is actually Helvetios, and then the verb is traduxisse. So Caesar was informed that the Helvetii, and then traduxisse is a form of the verb traduco, which literally means to lead across. It's trans plus duco. Okay, so Helvetios is our subject accusative, and traduxisse is the verb. That happens to be a perfect active infinitive. So the activity of leading across that is communicated by traduxisse, that will be happening before the main verb. What's the main verb? Factus est. That's perfect tense. And so here, if we want to make traduxisse sound like it's even before the perfect tense, we need to render that using the pluperfect tense. So we'll use the word had here as we translate traduxisse. Okay, so factus est is perfect tense, and then traduxisse will happen before that. Traduxisse is perfect tense. That means it's before the action of the main verb. So this translation will start out as Caesar was informed that the Helvetii had led across. And what did they lead across? Tres partes, 3 parts. And copiarum is genitive plural of the first declension noun copia, which can mean troops. So what we have so far would say Caesar was informed that the Helvetii had led across 3 parts of their troops. We'll throw in the word there in front of copiarum because that's understood. And then id flumen, as the footnote clearly explains, that's a secondary object of traduxisse. The feeling here is that, the TRA at the beginning of the word traduxisse, that's really a shortened version of the word trans, which means across. So the feeling here is the idea of across, that prepositional idea, is working with id flumen. So the idea is across this river, across that river, or across the river. Flumen, of course, is neuter in gender, and so we have the neuter form of is ea id here, which is id. And so id flumen, it could mean this river, that river, or if you feel like id here does not have a very strong demonstrative force, you could translate it simply as the. If you've already mentioned a river and everyone knows what river you're talking about, then id could simply just mean, the river in the sense of the river we're already talking about. So it doesn't necessarily have to have a very strong demonstrative force. So let's translate number 7 like this. Caesar was informed that the Helvetii had led 3 parts of their troops across the river. Number 8 is next. Caesar reperit domnorigem facultates ad largiendum magnas comparasse. Again, we have a main clause, and then that starts off some indirect discourse. So Caesar reperit, that's our main clause, and then we go into indirect speech. At first glance, you might think, reperit could be present tense or perfect tense. Which one is it? But keep in mind that in the perfect stem, it has 2 P's. So reperio, the verb, means to find out, learn, discover. And here it's present tense. If it were perfect tense, there would be an extra P in there. repperit. So with just 1 P, it's present tense. So reperit, Caesar is learning, Caesar is discovering, Caesar is finding out. Let's just say Caesar is discovering. And then we start into indirect speech. Domnorigem is our subject accusative. That's the accusative singular form of the third declension name, Dumnorix. Dumnorig, that is the genitive stem for that name, so we just add endings to that. So Dumnorigem is accusative singular, and that's the subject accusative. So Caesar is discovering that Dumnorix, blah, blah, blah. He's doing something. That's how this one starts out. And the verb here within the indirect discourse is comparasse. That's really comparawisse, but the V and the I have gone away. And that's a perfect tense infinitive, which is active. So comparasse, that's the verb comparo, which means to prepare, basically. So our main verb is present tense. The verb within the indirect speech is perfect tense. So to put the action of comparasse before the action of reperit, we can simply use, just a simple past tense in English to render that. So we can say, Caesar is discovering that Dumnorix prepared. For the remaining words here, facultates ad largiendum magnas, we have kind of a sandwich structure. Facultates and magnas go together. Why is magnas not first? Usually, adjectives of size or quantity go first. Not always, though. Facultates is the third declension noun. Facultas, we have lots of related English words like faculty. If someone tells you that someone has lost their faculties, it means that they've lost their abilities to do things. So facultas in Latin can mean ability. It can mean like an opportunity to do something. But it can also mean, in the plural, it can mean resources. And that's what we have here. Notice that facultates is plural. So Caesar is discovering that Dumnorix prepared resources. And then magnas is going along with that. So it's great resources. And then we have a gerund with the preposition ad showing purpose. So ad here means for the purpose of, and then largiendum means bribing. That's a gerund in the accusative case. So number 8 says, Caesar is discovering that Dumnorix prepared great resources for the purpose of bribing. Number 9 is next. Reperiebat initium fugae equitum factum esse a Dumnorige. We don't have an explicitly stated subject here. We just have the verb reperiebat, which means he, she, or it was discovering, probably talking about Julius Caesar, so we can just say he was discovering. And then initium means beginning or start, and it's going with fugae. Fugae is genitive singular. That's the noun fuga, which means flight or fleeing or perhaps retreat. We have English words like fugitive. If you're a fugitive, you're fleeing or running from something. And then equitum is genitive plural. And so the initium, the beginning, is the beginning of the flight. And then the flight is of the equitum, of the cavalryman. So we have a noun being possessed by a genitive, and then that genitive is being possessed by yet another genitive. I've heard this referred to in the past as a genitive chain, I think. Anyway, what we have is the beginning of the flight of the cavalryman. We could say of the cavalry, but I like to say cavalrymen just to help make it clear that it's actual people. Okay, so initium is the subject accusative of indirect discourse, and then factum esse is the infinitive verb of the indirect statement. So factum esse is a perfect tense passive infinitive. It's consisting of a perfect passive participle plus esse. So taking it from the top, he was discovering that the beginning of the flight of the cavalryman, factum esse, was made or was done. Now the main verb here is imperfect. That means it happened in the past. And the infinitive verb in our indirect statement is perfect tense. And so when that's the case, that means it happened before the activity of the main verb. So we'll treat factum esse as pluperfect and render it into English with the word had. So we'll say, he was discovering that the beginning of the flight of the cavalrymen had been done. Finally, we have an ablative of agent, a Dumnorige. That's ablative, and it means by Dumnorix. So number 9 says, he was discovering that the beginning of the flight of the cavalry had been done by Dumnorix. Number 10 is next. Considius dicit id se a Gallicis armis cognovisse. Again, we have someone saying something or learning something, followed by indirect discourse. So considius and dicit, that's the main clause. Considius says, or considius is saying. Considius here is talking about himself. So in the indirect discourse, say is the subject accusative. So Considius is saying that he cognovisse. Cognovisse is a perfect active infinitive. That's the verb cognosco, which means to learn. So we'll start out number 10 with Considius is saying, or Considius says, that he learned. The main verb is present tense, and then the verb in the indirect statement is perfect tense. So we'll just put that in the past and say learned. And then id is the direct object of cognovisse. So Considius says that he learned it. Okay, here we see the neuter gender being used to talk about some piece of news, some idea, some report. It has kind of an impersonal feeling to it. So the neuter gender is used for that. Id is neuter accusative singular, and it means roughly what our English word it would mean. If there were a masculine or feminine form of is id here, it would mean something different. Like if it said considius dicit eam or considius dicit eum, simply by changing the gender of it, it would move it away from meaning something inanimate. So the reason I'm pointing this out is to show you simply how the neuter gender can refer to something inanimate or something impersonal like that. Very much like it in English. So Considius says that he learned it, and then we have a prepositional phrase, a gallikis armis. So gallikis is a form of a first and second declension adjective, gallicus, gallica, gallicum, which means Gallic. And then the noun it's modifying is armis. That is the second declension noun, arma, which is a plural-only noun. It's a neuter noun of the second declension, but you only see it in the plural. So in the nominative, it's arma, neuter plural, and then in the genitive, it's armorum, and then dative and ablative are armis. So literally, Considius says that he learned it from Gallic arms, in the sense of Gallic weapons or military stuff, but you can't learn things from weapons. So what this really means is the people associated with the weapons, in other words, soldiers, military troops. So we can translate number 10 as Considius says that he learned it from the Gallic troops. Number 11 is next. Cognoit montem a suis teneri et Helvetios castra movisse. There is no explicitly stated subject here. We have the verb cognoit, so we'll just use the pronoun included in that verb. So cognoit says he, she, or it learned. That's a form of the verb cognosco. And then we launch into indirect discourse. You'll notice that we have two separate statements here in the indirect discourse, and they're connected by the word et. So montem a suis teneri, that's one statement, one full thought. And then Helvetios castra movisse is a second complete thought. So two thoughts connected by et. So the first clause in the indirect speech, montem a suis teneri, the subject accusative is montem, and then the infinitive verb is teneri. That's a passive verb. It means to be held. And it's present tense, so we'll put that in the same tense as the main verb. Cognoit is perfect tense, so we'll put teneri in the past just like cognoit. Same tense as cognoit. So he learned that, and then montem is the subject, the mountain, and then teneri, we'll translate that as was being held. So he learned that the mountain was being held a suis. That's an ablative of agent. Whenever you have a passive verb, you can have an ablative of agent showing who that action is being done by. And so here, the action of holding is being done a suis, by his own troops or by his own men. Suis, of course, is suis sua suum, which means his, her, or its. So he learned that the mountain was being held by his own. And that's a substantive, so we need to throw in the word men, throw in the word troops, something like that. Then we have et, and then we go into a second idea or clause. And this one has yet another subject accusative and another infinitive verb. So Helvetios is the subject accusative. Movisse is a perfect tense active infinitive. That means to move, and since it's perfect tense, that means it's going to happen before the time frame of the main verb. Castra is the direct object, so the idea here is the Helvetii moving their camp. Now we have to talk about the tenses a bit more. In this first clause, montem a suis teneri, the infinitive verb is present tense. So we can say, he learned that the mountain was held or was being held. But then when we get to the part about movisse, That's perfect tense, so that needs to happen before the main verb. So tenere is one tense, and then moise is another tense. So we'll translate each of these two clauses in a different tense. So we'll say, he learned that the mountain was being held by his own men, and that the Helvetii had moved their camp. So since moise is a perfect tense infinitive, we need to put that before the past tense expressed by cognovit, and to do that, we'll put it into the pluperfect. Number 12 is next. Persuasit eis ut auxilium rogarent. We don't have an explicitly stated subject here. We have persuasit as the verb. That's a perfect tense form of persuadeo, which means to persuade. It's third person singular, so it means something like he, she, or it persuaded. And then, of course, persuadeo takes the dative, so eis is a dative plural form of is id. That's the people being persuaded. He, she, or it is persuading them, and then we have a result clause starting with ut, telling us what exactly it is someone's persuading somebody to do. Rogarent means ask. That's the verb rogo. We can translate it simply as ask or ask for. And then auxilium means help. That's the direct object of rogarent. So number 12 says, he persuaded them that they ask for help. Or, in better English, smoother English, he persuaded them to ask for help. Number 13 is next. Cum concedissent imperator eam legionem laudavit, quae fuerat fortissima. Here we have a cum clause. Quick review, there are 4 kinds of cum clause, one that takes the indicative and 3 others that take the subjunctive. When cum takes the indicative, it usually just means when, like timing. But when cum takes the subjunctive, it can be one of 3 kinds of clause. It can be a circumstantial clause, and you'll translate cum as under the circumstances that, or it can be causal, a cum causal clause, and you'll translate cum as because or since, or it can be concessive, where you're conceding something, and you'll translate cum as although. So let's figure out what kind of cum clause it is. We have cum concedissent. That's definitely a subjunctive verb. That's concedo, which means to encamp. And that's a pluperfect subjunctive. So cum will say, although, since, or under the circumstances that they had encamped. Then we have imperator laudavit. That means the general, or the commander-in-chief, rather, laudavit. He praised. Imperator means basically the commander-in-chief, the top-ranking general in charge of the whole thing. So for lack of a better term, we'll translate it as commander-in-chief. Laudavit is perfect tense. It means he praised. And legionem is the direct object. So he praised the legion. We have eam here. That's a feminine accusative singular form of is id, because legio, from the third declension, is also feminine and accusative. So it means the commander-in-chief praised this legion, that legion, or just the legion. Then we have a relative clause starting with quae. So quae fuerat fortissima is a relative clause starting with quae. The antecedent here is legionem. Quae is feminine because legionem is feminine. Quae is singular because legionem is singular. But it's nominative because of the role it plays in the relative clause. Within the relative clause, quae is the subject. So we'll translate quae as which. Fuerat is pluperfect. That means had been. And fortissima is a superlative adjective that means bravest. Fortissima is feminine because it's still talking about the legio, the legion, which is grammatically feminine. So legionem, quae, and fortissima, they're all feminine based upon the fact that the third declension noun legio is grammatically feminine. In fact, all those third declension nouns that end in io in the nominative singular, those are all feminine. So legio is a classic case of a third declension noun ending in io that is feminine. So the commander-in-chief praised the legion which had been bravest. Or we could say the commander-in-chief praised that legion which had been the bravest. Here again, we see that isea id doesn't always have a very strong demonstrative force like ille or hic. So you don't always have to translate it as this or that. It's good to just let the context help you. Now for the matter of what kind of cum clause we have with a cum concedissent, let's try it with all three kinds and just see what happens. Let's try it with although. Although they had encamped, the commander-in-chief praised the legion which had been most brave. That doesn't really make much sense, because when you say although, it makes it sound like the circumstances would somehow work against the praising of the brave legion. But that's not the case here. Setting up camp doesn't somehow conflict with praising someone. So the subordinate clause here and the main clause are not at odds with each other in any way. So treating cum concedissent as a concessive clause doesn't really make much sense. Let's try a cum causal clause. Just for learning, let's try it and see what happens. Because they had encamped, the commander-in-chief praised the legion which had been most brave. That doesn't really make much sense either, because there's no connection, there's no causal connection between the fact that they set up camp and the praising of the brave legion. So that doesn't really have a whole lot of sense to it. Let's try it as a cum circumstantial. Under the circumstances that they had encamped, the commander-in-chief praised the legion which had been most brave. Now that makes more sense, because the idea is they have a battle, and then when the battle's over, they settle down in their camp, they set up the camp, they put up the tents, they dig the fortifications, and then after everything has settled down a bit, and they have some time, then the commander-in-chief calls a big meeting of everyone. In the Army, that's called a stand-to, when everyone has to get together and listen to what the leader is saying. In the Navy, they call it an all-hands, like all hands on deck. So that's probably what's happening here, is cum concedissent is a cum circumstantial clause. The authors of the book would like for you to say, when they had encamped, the commander-in-chief praised the legion which had been most brave. That's what the authors of the book are telling you to do. I'm trying to guide you more toward translating a cum circumstantial by saying under the circumstances that. It's a bit more clunky, but for me it's a bit more accurate, because for me it's easy to misunderstand when they had encamped. It's easy to misunderstand that as a temporal kind of thing, something referring to time instead of circumstances. So that's a thing I've been trying to get you to understand, is that translating a cum circumstantial with the word when can deceive you into thinking that it's talking about time when it's not. It could be talking about time as part of the circumstances, but really what it's talking about is the general circumstances that surround what's happening in the main clause. And that's why it's called a cum circumstantial, because it's talking about circumstances. So if you want, you can translate it as when they had encamped, but in the answer key, I'm going to put under the circumstances that they had encamped, the commander-in-chief praised the legion which had been bravest. Let's move on now to section 425. Usually when we get to the translation part of each lesson, that's the end of the lesson. But this lesson, lesson 53, is particularly long. And in fact, we still need to read a section of Caesar's Gallic Wars. So let's take a quick look at 425 and 426. In 425, they want to make you aware of the big grouping of verbs that pertain to the perfect stem. So grammarians call this the perfect system. As you look at the chart, what you'll see is that what they all have in common is that they're based on the perfect stem. So perfect, pluperfect, future perfect. And as they say here, these are all active forms. We're not talking about passive things. We're not talking about perfect passive verbs, like with a perfect passive participle plus a form of sum. That's not part of what they're talking about here because it's not based on the perfect stem. Okay, quick review of the perfect stem. One way to find it is to take the first person singular perfect tense form, active. So for laudo, that would be laudavi, and you take away the I, and that gives you laudav. So for the verb laudo, that would be the perfect stem, laudav. So using that perfect stem, you can add on endings, and you can make the perfect tense active forms. You can add eram, eras, erat, and get pluperfect forms. You can add ero and get a future perfect. You can add erim, eris, erit, very similar to what the future perfect looks like, with I think just one or two forms different, and that'll give you the perfect subjunctive. And then using the same perfect stem, you can add isse plus endings and get a pluperfect subjunctive. And you can even add isse by itself and get a perfect infinitive. So they're calling this the perfect system. And again, the thing they all have in common is they're based on the perfect stem. So they just want to make you aware of this complex of related verbs. In section 426, they're talking about what they call the supine system. And it's a little bit confusing to me because really all the forms here are participles. But what they're saying is that they're based on the supine stem. And the supine stem is the same as the stem for perfect passive participles. We've talked about this many times, how the accusative supine looks just like a neuter perfect passive participle. In other words, for laudo, the neuter perfect passive participle would be laudatum, and the supine in the accusative would be laudatum. So when they say supine stem here, that's the same as the stem that would be in a perfect passive participle. So for laudo, it would be laudat. And so here in section 426, they want to make you aware of all the different verbs that are based upon that same stem. And these are all participles or verb tenses comprised of a participle plus a verb of being, which we can call a compound tense, also a periphrastic tense. In grammar books, that's what they call verb forms that consist of a participle plus a verb of being. So in the left-hand column, we have indicative forms. You take the participle and you add sum, laudata sum, that gives you a perfect tense passive verb. For a pluperfect passive verb, you switch the verb of being to eram, make that imperfect, and laudatus eram means I had been praised. Change it to ero, and you get laudatus ero, I will have been praised. So laudatus sum, I was praised. Laudatus eram, I had been praised. Laudatus ero, I will have been praised. All those verbs have the same participle. The only thing that's different is the form of sum that goes with it. So that's a nice comparison for a student, just to see how those match up or how they compare with each other. Now, if you have a future active participle, like laudaturus, that's about to praise, you can pair that up with esse and have a future active infinitive. That's a gendered verb, but what is not gendered, in the same way at least, is laudatum iri. That's a future passive infinitive. Notice that that is neuter because it's expressing meaning in such a way where it's got an impersonal kind of feeling to it. So iri is a passive infinitive expressing something like a going is occurring or there is a going happening. And then laudatum is really a supine in the accusative expressing purpose. So that's kind of a weird verb form. Laudatum iri. To, in the future, be praised. That's really what that amounts to. But again, notice that that's neuter because it's functioning in an impersonal kind of way. It's not going to agree with the subject it's talking about. Laudatus esse, that's a perfect passive participle plus esse. And again, that gives you an infinitive, but it's a perfect passive infinitive. To have been praised. For a perfect tense passive subjunctive, you'll take the perfect passive participle, laudatus, and then you'll pair it up with a subjunctive form of sum, so you can get laudatus sim, and in the pluperfect, laudatus essem. Again, the participle is the same, you're just messing around with the form of sum that goes with it. The future active participle, moving down the right-hand column, laudaturus, that means about to praise or going to praise. When I was growing up in the country, people would say fixin' to do something. I'm fixin' to go to the store. So you could say laudaturus is fixin' to praise. And then laudatus is a perfect passive participle having been praised. Or you could just translate it as praised. Finally, the supine, laudatum. Keep in mind that that's the supine in the accusative form. There are two forms of the supine, accusative and ablative. The ablative one would be laudatu. So anyway, what they want to do here in 426 is make you aware of all these different verb forms that rely on that particular stem, L-A-U-D-A-T. They're calling it the supine stem. It's the same stem that is used to build the future active participle and the perfect passive participle. Let's move on to section 427, and we're going to finish up chapter 3 of book 1 of Caesar's Gallic Wars. And as I usually mention, it would probably be beneficial to you to turn off the recording and try to translate it yourself before listening to me talk about it. So that might be a good thing for you to do. So if that's what you want to do, go ahead and turn the recording off now and take a whack at it, and then turn the recording back on. Okay, let's go over this Caesar reading together. We'll start with the first sentence, maybe the first line. Per facile factu esse illis probat conata perficere. We do not have an explicitly stated subject. We have probat, which means he, she, or it is showing, he, she, or it is demonstrating, and the subject is orgetrix, because we're continuing to talk about how orgetrix is trying to persuade people to do things. When last we left our hero, and I say that facetiously, in the last reading, he was trying to do some shady backroom deals with some aristocrats from other Gallic tribes. Okay, he's trying to convince them to engage in like a power grab or a political coup. Caesar is continuing to tell us about the political circumstances here in Helvetia and in the surrounding tribes. So here, orgetrix is continuing to explain things, to try to persuade people, to talk people into things. So probat here is talking about orgetrix. If you'll remember, he's the Helvetian guy who has been put in charge of their big plan to buy up carts and plant lots of grain and then do a mass exodus from their homeland. And he's also been given some diplomatic duties. And as part of those diplomatic duties, he's trying to cook up a plan with some other aristocrats from other tribes. So probat is orgeterix demonstrates, or orgeterix shows, something like that. And then illis is a form of ille, which means that. It's dative plural, so it means to those people, or to them. So illis and probat says he is showing to them, or he demonstrates to them. And now we're going to slip into indirect speech. As we saw in a previous exercise, conata and perficere together are going to form a noun clause. Conata means undertakings. That's neuter plural. And perficere means to accomplish. That's an infinitive. So conata and perficere together say to accomplish the undertakings. Okay, so those two words together form a noun clause, which is the subject in an indirect statement. The verb in the indirect statement, as always, is an infinitive, and that's esse. Probat, conata perficere, and esse. Those three things together say he demonstrates that to accomplish the undertakings is. Conata perficere is the subject accusative in the sense that it's a noun clause. Esse is the infinitive verb. And then we have a predicate adjective with perfacule. Perfacule means very easy, and it's in the neuter gender. Why is it neuter? Because perficere, when it's being used as a noun like that, it is, grammatically speaking, neuter in gender. Another thing to think about is that perfacule is accusative. Remember that for neuter nouns and adjectives, the nominative and accusative always look the same. So conata perficere, as a noun clause, grammatically is considered to be accusative and neuter. And so to modify that, perfacule, grammatically speaking, is also neuter and accusative. Just by merely looking at conata perficere, you can't tell that it's neuter and accusative. There's nothing that would outwardly indicate that. But within the structure of the Latin grammar, as a noun clause, it's functioning as an accusative because it's the subject of indirect statement. And remember that grammatically speaking, whenever you use an infinitive as a noun, the infinitive is considered to be neuter in gender. So if you have a sentence that says, to walk is good, okay, and you say, ambulare est good. In that kind of sentence in Latin, you're using the infinitive ambulare as a noun. You're saying to walk in a substantive sense, the activity of walking, to walk is good. So to make that a correct Latin sentence, you would make your predicate adjective neuter. You'd say ambulare est bonum. Bonum, being neuter, is the correct way to modify the infinitive when it's being used as a noun, because grammatically speaking, it's considered to be neuter. So I think that because the noun clause here, conata perficere, I think really it's based mainly upon this infinitive, perficere. And so for that reason, when they have perfacule, if you say to accomplish the undertakings is, you're not going to say perfaculus, which would be masculine or feminine. You'd say perfacule. So we have a neuter adjective modifying basically what is an infinitive, perficere. And then again, as I mentioned before, perfacule really is accusative. It's neuter and accusative. So the noun clause conata perficere is neuter and accusative as a noun clause. It's accusative because it's the subject accusative in indirect speech, and it's neuter because mainly what it is, it's that infinitive, perficere. And grammatically, an infinitive, when being used as a noun like that, is neuter. So that's why perfacule is neuter and accusative. Perfacule is working along with factu. That's a supine in the ablative. So very easy with respect to the doing, or very easy in the doing. Or in smoother English, very easy to do. So this first line, there's really a lot going on here as far as figuring out how the words connect to each other grammatically. So I just wanted to take a minute to explain some of that. So we'll read it like this. He, referring to Orgeterix, he demonstrates to them that to accomplish the undertakings is very easy to do. Moving on. Propterea quod ipse suae civitatis imperium obtenturus esset. Propterea quod is kind of a stock phrase that means because of the fact that, or on account of the fact that. Propter means on account of, and then ea is some form of is ea id, perhaps a neuter plural that just got, connected to propter over time through frequent use. And then quod means something like that. So put it all together, and propterea quod says something like on account of the fact that. That's really the best way to translate that little stock phrase. So propterea quod says on account of the fact that, and then ipse, that's the intensive pronoun. It means things like himself, herself, itself. Here it's referring to Orgeterix, so it means he himself. He's saying that he himself is going to do some stuff. So ipse refers to Orgeterix. Okay, so taking it from the beginning, it says, he demonstrates to them that to accomplish the undertakings is very easy to do on account of the fact that he himself, blah, blah, blah. So he's telling his listeners that he himself is going to do things to ensure that this plan will work. So he's trying to talk them into it, or perhaps show that he personally is going to see to it that this plan gets put into motion and that the things that need to happen are going to happen. Now notice in line 3 how we continue on there in indirect speech. Everything after probat in line 1 is really indirect discourse. The verb there is esse. Then I think that this clause here after propterea quod is considered to be a subordinate clause because it has a subjunctive verb. Notice that esset is subjunctive. But then after that, we have non esse dubium. So we switch right back into indirect discourse with the infinitive esse. In Latin grammar, there's this basic rule that within indirect speech, if you have a relative clause within indirect speech, it's supposed to have a subjunctive verb. So I think that's what's happening here. Propterea quod is setting up something that grammatically resembles a relative clause. And so that's why esset is subjunctive. That's about the best explanation I can come up with. You could also see it as functioning as a noun clause, starting with quod through esset. You could see that as a noun clause, which would then be a subordinate clause, which would then need a subjunctive verb. Anyway, just notice that there's a subjunctive verb there, esset, but then after that, we flip right back into normal indirect discourse, starting with non esse. So with ipse, he's talking about himself. He's saying that he himself, and then esset, would be, that's imperfect subjunctive, and then obtenturus is a future active participle. So obtenturus, that's the verb obteneo, which means to hold, or take, or seize, or obtain. It can mean lots of things. So literally, esset and obtenturus would say he would be about to take, or he would be about to seize, or he would be about to obtain. Probably we can just translate it into English as he himself was about to obtain. Or a smoother translation would say he would obtain, or he was going to obtain. There are different ways to render it into English. The point here is that he's saying that he's got a plan of his own, that he wants to grab power in his own state, which, if you'll remember, he's a Helvetian. So he went to the Sequani and tried to convince a guy to stage a coup, and he went to the Haidui and tried to convince somebody to stage a coup. We read about that last time. Now he's saying that he has his own plan to stage a coup. So what does this mean? It means that he's trying to get 3 different tribes all at the same time to have a coup where they overthrow their existing government, and then those people take power. Those are 3 of the largest tribes in Gaul. So this is really going to result in a huge political upheaval. And of course, this is all coming to us through Julius Caesar. We just kind of have to take his word for it. If what he is reporting to us is accurate, this was really going to be a huge deal, a huge, basically a political revolution in Gaul. Ipse, esset, and obtenturus, that he himself was about to obtain. And then we have imperium, that's the direct object of obtenturus. And so imperium means power or command. And then sui civitatis, of his own state. So this says, on account of the fact that he himself was going to obtain the command of his own state. So lots of military or political coups being planned here. Now with non esse, we go back into indirect discourse. Of course, that's working from Probot on line 1. So let's continue reading. Non esse dubium quin totius Galliae plurimum Helvetii posint. Probot from line 1, and then non esse dubium, put that together, and it says, he is demonstrating that there is not a doubt, or it is not doubtful. In regular speech, direct discourse, it would be non est dubium. But here in indirect speech, the verb has to be an infinitive, so it's non esse dubium. So he is demonstrating that there is no doubt, and then queen means but that. So there is no doubt but that, and then we have Helvetii plus a subjunctive verb. Again, we have a subordinate clause here within indirect speech. Of course, a queen clause is going to have a subjunctive verb anyway. Notice that we're in secondary sequence here because probot, despite the fact that it's a present tense verb, it's being used as historical present. So it's the present tense, but it's talking about past events using the present tense to make it sound more exciting, more vivid. So historical present is telling us about the past. So that's considered here to be a secondary tense. And so these subordinate clauses also have secondary tenses so that we can stay in secondary sequence. So esset from line 3, that's a secondary sequence. Posent from line 4, secondary sequence. So we're in secondary sequence here, despite the fact that probot is present because it's historical present. With plurimum at the end of line 3 and posent on line 4, we have that idiom about being most powerful. Usually, possum means to be able to do something, but with this idiom here with plurimum, it means to have the most influence or to be most powerful. Literally, posent and plurimum says to be powerful the most. And then totius Galliae says of all Gaul. That's genitive. So this line reads, in indirect speech, there is no doubt but that the Helvetii were the most powerful of all Gaul. Moving on. Se suis copiis suoque exercitu, illis regna conciliaturum confirmat. What we have here is some more indirect speech, but with a new verb starting it off. Confirmat here, again, it's present tense. So the idea with confirmat is he reiterates, or he confirms, or perhaps he declares. And then that starts more indirect speech with se as the subject accusative and conciliaturum as the infinitive verb within indirect discourse. Now, you may be asking yourself the question, why did you just say that conciliaturum is an infinitive? That's not an infinitive. That's a future active participle. Sometimes in Latin literature, when there is a periphrastic tense, remember that's a tense consisting of a participle plus a verb of being, a form of sum. Sometimes when they have that, they leave out the form of sum and it's understood. Okay, so really, to make a future active infinitive, we need conciliaturum esse, to be about to win over. Okay, this verb conciliaturum, that's the verb concilio, which means to unite, to bring together. It means to win over someone. Like if you persuade someone that you are right and you win them over to your side of the argument, it can mean lots of different things. So let's look at the grammar here, and then as we go along, we'll try to figure out specifically what conciliaturum is communicating here. When you see conciliaturum, think of conciliaturum esse. Julius Caesar, what he's communicating here is conciliaturum esse, but he has left out the word esse because it's understood. So we need to supply the understood word esse here. If you want, you can get a pencil and write a tiny esse in there where the footnote 7 is, or the number 7. So concilio can mean to unite, to bring together, to procure, to win over. It can mean lots of things. But grammatically what we have here is he confirms, confirmat, he declares or he confirms that, going into indirect discourse, that se conciliaturum esse, that he would, in the future, unite, gain, win over. That's what's happening here grammatically. And what will he unite or gain or win over? The regna. That means the different kingdoms that have been referred to earlier, the different Gallic tribes. This is the second declension noun regnum, which means kingdom or kingship, or perhaps sovereignty. Here we can just translate it as kingdoms. So confirmat here, we could translate that different ways. What he's doing here is he's strongly asserting something. He's trying to describe it to them in a way where it's a sure thing. So we could translate confirmat as he asserts it, he proves it, he affirms it, whatever can communicate that he's stating it strongly. We could even translate it simply as confirm, which is really not a bad way to do it. Of course, that's where we get our English word confirm. But that's not a bad way to translate it. So let's do that. Let's say he confirms that he, conciliaturum esse, will win over, gain, do something to the regna, the kingdoms. And then we have illis, that's a form of ille, which means that. So this is dative plural, and that's talking about the group of people who will benefit here. It means something like for them. So he confirms that he will gain or win over or unite the kingdoms for them. Who's the them? I think it's referring to the different people that he's trying to talk into his scheme. People like Casticus, people like Dumnorix, the people mentioned in the last reading that he's trying to persuade to stage a coup. And how does Orgetorix plan to do all this? Well, we have some ablatives of means here. Suis copiis, that means by means of his own troops. Copia, in the plural, can mean troops. So suis copiis, by means of his own troops. It could possibly mean by his own resources, in the sense of his own financial backing. So it could mean resources, or it could mean troops. It's hard to tell. Next, we have suoque exercitu. That definitely means by means of his own army. So the que ending there on suo, that supplies the word and. So it says by means of his own copiis and by means of his own army. That's all ablative of means. If copiis means troops, then that's really just restating what exercitu is saying. That would be redundant. So copiis here probably means something like his personal resources, his personal wealth, his financial backing, his property that he owns. So suis copiis, suoque exercitu, probably means something like by means of his own resources and by means of his own army. So he's assuring them that he is going to do all this stuff. In fact, assure, that's probably not a bad way to translate confirmat. He assures them. So how do we translate conciliaturum? What fits best here in context with what's going on? Is he saying that he will unite the kingdoms with his army, or that he will win over the kingdoms with his army, or that he will gain the kingdoms with his army? It could be any of those. It could be that he will unite them, not using his army to force them to do anything, but by showing how powerful his army is and getting them to willingly go along with a powerful guy, someone who can really get things done. You know, they might look at him and say, wow, he's wealthy and powerful. Let's go along with him. So he could be saying conciliaturum in the sense of winning them over like that, or uniting them, not necessarily against their will, like forcing them, but sort of just doing a show of force and a show of resources and getting them to go along with it willingly. And so as I think it over, translating conciliaturum as win over, that sounds pretty good. So let's translate conciliaturum as win over in the sense of persuade or convince. So confirmat here is a verb of him saying something, and that takes us into indirect speech, starting with se. And then we supply the word esse to go along with conciliaturum, forming a future active infinitive. Remember, in indirect speech, the verb has to be an infinitive. This section will say this: he confirms that he will win over the kingdoms for them by means of his own resources and by means of his own army. Moving on. Hac oratione adducti inter se fidem et iusiorandum dant. So apparently, Orgetorix is a good talker because, according to this, he persuades them and they buy into it. They decide to go along with his plan. Adducti means having been influenced, and then hac oratione is ablative of means. It says, by means of this speech. And you remember that from one of our exercises. Having been influenced by means of this speech, then we have the verb dant, which means they give. And then inter se is among themselves. And what are they giving among themselves? Fidem et iusiorandum. Fidem means pledge. That's a fifth declension noun that we've studied. It's in the accusative case because it's the direct object of dant. And then iusiorandum, as a noun, that means an oath. Literally, as you can see, the etymology there is in the footnote, ius, which means right or law or something like that. And then iurandum means to be sworn. That's a gerundive. Sometimes when certain phrases or words are just used over and over again, they're used so frequently that they just become new words in their own right. And so jus jurandum has just become a noun in and of itself. So dant inter se, they give among themselves a pledge and an oath. So they're swearing to this. They're all swearing together that they will do this plan to overthrow the governments, to stage coups in their own tribes. Moving on, we have et regno occupato. That's an ablative absolute. It says, with the kingship having been taken, or something like that. That's the verb occupo, which can mean to seize. Again, that's an ablative absolute. With the kingship having been seized, we need to go to the end and look at sperant. That's the verb spero, which means hope. So sperant is third person plural, present tense. So it means they hope or they are hoping, and that will launch us into more indirect discourse. Sese, potiri, and posse, that's indirect discourse. Sese is the subject accusative. Posse is the verb. That means to be able. Posse is the present tense infinitive of possum. So sperant, sese, and posse says they hope that they are able. And then potiri is a complementary infinitive working with posse. That's the deponent verb potior, which means to take possession of. Potior is one of those special verbs that usually takes the ablative, but it can also take the genitive too. I've been told that it takes the genitive when it's talking about governments and countries and taking over power. And that's what we have here. Totios Gallii is genitive, working with potiri. So the last few words here say, they hope that they are able to take possession of all Gaul. Finally, we have per tres potentissimos ac firmissimos populos. Not too difficult. It says through, in the sense of through the agency of, or by means of, through the three most powerful, that's potentissimos. Ac means and also, that's an abbreviated form of atque. And firmissimos populos, that means strongest peoples or strongest nations. So they hope that they can or are able to take possession of all Gaul through the three most powerful and strong nations. And who are the three nations we're talking about? We're talking about the Helvetii, the Haidui, and the Sequani. Those are the tribes that have been mentioned in recent readings. Remember, Orgetorix went on a diplomatic mission. He went to the Sequani and talked to a guy named Casticus. He went to the Haidui and talked to a guy named Dumnorix. And he convinced them to stage a coup. And then he says he'll stage his own coup in the Helvetii tribe. So those are the three tribes being referred to here, the Helvetii, the Sequani, and the Haidui. And so they're cooking up this plot. They're saying, well, we're the three most powerful tribes. They're saying, we're the three most powerful and strong tribes in all of Gaul. If our three tribes work together and we each take control of our own tribes, we can really put this thing together and take control of the entire region of Gaul. So as you can imagine, for Orgetorix to go around and do this kind of thing is really illegal. He can't just go off on his own and try to convince people to stage a coup. And he can't just go around telling other people that he's going to stage a coup and he's going to seize power. This is totally illegal. This is outside of his governmental duties that he's been assigned. Remember that he was assigned to be in charge of the mass exodus, or at least the preparations for it. And he was given some diplomatic duties, apparently, according to what Caesar is telling us. So he does have some official duties, but staging a coup and taking over his whole country, that's not part of his duties. That's just him trying to stage a coup. So what he's doing is totally illegal within his own nation, and trying to get other people to do the same thing. It's really totally illegal and totally treasonous viewed in the context of his own government. So he's really cooking up a bad plan here. And as we read on in subsequent sections, we'll see that he gets in big trouble for it. Vercingetorix is going to get what's coming to him in subsequent readings. I don't want to spoil the ending, spoiler alert, but, well, you'll see what happens. I won't give it away. Let's just say he gets in trouble. Okay, so in this reading, we've seen lots of indirect discourse, and then within that, we've seen subordinate clauses that have subjunctive verbs. Also, we saw a future active infinitive with esse left out, or you could say, as my old Latin teacher used to say, with a suppressed esse. Esse is just understood there. We've seen lots of idioms like plurimum potest. We have an ablative absolute. We have a naughty nine adjective, totius. We've got deponent verbs. There's a lot going on here, and I think you're to be congratulated for sticking with me this long. This is lesson 53, and if you're still listening to me at this stage, you've really come a long way. Again, I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you're getting a lot out of it. Don't forget to try to speak Latin and treat it as an actual fully active and vibrant spoken language, and that's going to help you study it. You'll learn it faster and better. So keep that in mind as you go. That having been said, that brings us to the end of yet another installment of Lenny's Latin class. We'll see you again next time in lesson 54.